Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eisenberg, and I am Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Florida. Welcome to our first Frontier Forum of the academic year, hosted by the University of South Florida College of Arts and Sciences, and presented in partnership with the USF Institute on Russia and the USF Humanities Institute. As we've all seen in the last election cycle, democracy in practice can be quite an adventure, messy, tumultuous, and not to be taken for granted. Tonight, we're going to be joined by our special guest speaker to discuss the current risks to democracies around the world and how disinformation campaigns and propaganda aim to dismantle and erode trust in governments, both abroad and here at home in the United States. Before we start, I want to say a hearty thank you to our generous donors who support this Frontiers of Knowledge program. The continued success of this program provides opportunities to bring thought leaders like Anne Applebaum to USF, which would not be possible without your support. I also want to take just a quick couple of minutes to share with you some recent developments at the university as it relates to our search for a new president. As most of you know, interim President Rhea Law stepped in when President Corral announced his retirement in August. And in the last 2 months, she has taken bold steps to prepare USF for the selection and transition to a new president. In so doing, she and the Presidential Search Committee have enlisted the help of the community by releasing an electronic survey. The intent of the survey is to collect feedback from students, alumni, faculty, staff, and community leaders about what qualities are of priority in the selection of our next president. If you are interested in submitting responses to this survey, it will be open through October 20th, and you can find it at usf.to/survey. Additionally, there have been a series of virtual town halls in which members of the USF community have had the opportunity to share their input and voice any questions and concerns. I am confident that under the wise guidance of interim President Law and the diligence of the search committee, that this search will yield a highly qualified leader for the University of South Florida. It's with your support and feedback on issues such as this that will help propel the university to accomplish our strategic goals and maintain our upward academic trajectory. Just this last month, for the third consecutive year, the University of South Florida was named the fastest rising university in the country by US News and World Report. With this distinction, USF ranks as one of the nation's top 50 publics, taking into consideration such factors as student graduation rates, retention rates, class size, student debt, faculty resources, and academic reputation. This ranking, by the way, is inclusive of performance across all three of our wonderful campuses in Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Sarasota, Manatee. Equally important, we have managed to elevate our academic profile while retaining our unshakable commitment to racial and ethnic diversity and inclusion. Back to this evening. Over the years, the College of Arts and Sciences has hosted more than 25 notable public intellectuals, including Jane Goodall, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Roxane Gay, Matthew Desmond, and Ibram Kendi. Since its inception, the Frontier Forum Lecture Series has worked to connect public intellectuals to the community in support of the liberal arts and sciences. It is our mission to bring these important discussions to the forefront, often at times when we need them the most. Our speaker tonight, Anne Applebaum, is a Pulitzer-prize winning historian with particular expertise in the history of communist and post-communist Europe, a staff writer for The Atlantic, and a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where she co-leads ARENA, a research project on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. Her powerful new book, which I know many of you have already read, The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, is one of the topics for our discussion this evening. It highlights the rise of right-wing populist politics and provides an analysis of how ordinary people come to support authoritarianism. I want to note that we will open our chat box about halfway through the program, where attendees will have the opportunity to submit questions for Anne during the Q&A portion of our discussion. So please submit those questions and I will relay them to Anne Applebaum. I know that this examination of democracies and the corruption that intends to disrupt them will be a welcome and timely dialogue. So with this, I'd like to welcome Anne Applebaum.
Good evening.
Good evening. Great to see you. So, Anne, I have watched many of your interviews, and I'm going to try hard to find some entertaining new questions for you. Let me say right up front, at the risk of embarrassing you, that I think that your work is brilliant and should be required reading for anyone like myself who is struggling with the dynamics of the current moment. Like so many other people, I've basically been asking myself, how could this be happening in my country again and again over the past few years? And what I find is that you offer some answers. So just to sort of start the conversation, one of the things that you talk about in your latest book is that this is not just an American issue. This is a global issue with historical roots. Can you talk about attacks on democracy across the world? You talk about how Poland and Hungary have struggled in similar ways, moving away from democracy and the rule of law in favor of an illiberal one-party state. Why are these transitions happening now? And what are the lessons for the United States in this global context?
So, first of all, thank you for that comprehensive question. And before I answer it, thank you for inviting me to your lecture series. I was particularly pleased to learn that it's designed to engage the public and not just a university audience. One of my really strong feelings about universities is they should be much more part of public life than they have lately been in the United States. So yes, in fact, the starting point for my book, I mean, there were sort of two starting points. One was a realization 2 or 3 years ago that I wasn't speaking to some people who I used to speak to, which sounds a bit silly. But I realized that people who I had been, if not friendly with, then acquaintances with, people who had been part of my life, had evolved in a very different political direction.
Mm,
And I started thinking about why that could be, what some of the explanations were. And as I thought about the problem, I realized that I was talking about something that had happened in Poland, where I've spent on and off a lot of the last 30 years. My husband is Polish. I covered the collapse of communism in Poland. We own a house there. I've been very involved in the country, for a long time, and I've watched very dramatic changes. But there was really a very similar process taking place in the UK, where I've also spent a lot of time. It's where I am tonight. Um, uh, and also something very similar in Poland and Hungary. Hungary is a country I visited a lot. I wrote a book that was partly about Hungary. Um, and I realized that we were dealing with something that was really a historical phenomenon. In other words, we were watching a kind of change of political paradigm, and it was happening in a lot of countries with very different historical and political and sociological backgrounds and traditions. When you think about the United States and Poland, these are countries that really have nothing to do with one another. There's nothing similar
mhm.
about them. They're not ethnically similar or historically similar or culturally similar in any way. And yet I have to tell you, the dynamics of politics in Poland, which is a profoundly divided society, very bitterly polarized,
Mm,
and the dynamics of politics in the United States aren't as different as you would think they would be. And I felt that required some kind of explanation, because there's certainly no moment, in the previous 500 years where you could have said that about these two countries. And the book gives a lot of different kinds of answers. I mean, some of them are personal to individuals. They are to do with choices that people make about their
mhm.
careers and their lives. But some of the answers are more global, and maybe we can get into some of them. I mean, one of them is that all of us everywhere in the democratic world are living through a really profound transition and a deep change in the way that we get and process information, including
Ah,
political information, but
mhm.
not only. The way we see it, how it's framed, how we understand it. We now read news on our telephones, where it comes in streams. What happened yesterday in Congress, plus what our cousin did yesterday, plus news about celebrities, plus the weather. It
Right.
comes in a stream, whether you see it on Facebook or you see it on Twitter or you see it on messages on your phone, comes
Mhm.
in this kind of nonstop sort of information overload, and sorting through what matters and what doesn't has become a much different kind of project. And the other issue is that these new forums in which we have discussion and democratic debate are not structured around the idea of creating consensus or creating constructive conversation. The Facebook algorithms are set to increase emotion. Things spread fastest the more angry they make you. Conspiracy theory is one of the things that angers and intrigues and interests people. That's one of the reasons why it moves so fast across the internet. And so the change in the nature of information, which is simultaneous, and it's this no different in the Philippines or Turkey or Brazil than it is in the United States, I think is one fundamental piece of it. There are other things as well. The nature of the global economy. I mean, people want to talk about economics. We all have this instinct that we want to have an economic explanation for everything that happens, because then that's simple. Then there would be a kind of clear answer. Well, you fix the policy and that will fix the problem. I mean, I think actually the economic part of the answer is more complicated than that. It's to do with the sense that people have of losing control. So it's not just inequality. It's not just the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. It's the sense that decisions are made in China and they affect us here in Tampa, and there's nothing that we can do about it, and our politicians don't seem to control it. And a feeling that we don't have influence, we don't matter, decisions are somehow taken far away in other places and they don't affect us. And that's not wrong. I mean, there's an element of truth to that. And so, that, and, the change in information, the third element I would mention, just to finish this question, is also the rise of autocracies that are real competitors in multiple ways to the United States and sort of the American European model. China, and it's not just China, it's China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. But China has an argument that previous autocracies, 20th century autocracies, didn't have, which is offers people a development model. Look, we can help you get rich, we can help you develop your GDP, and we don't have to have all this squabbling of democracy and all this silly stuff you see on American television. We can do it faster. And there's also, during the Cold War, the appeal of America was not just political, it was also cultural, it was economic. We had abstract expressionism and blue jeans and Hollywood. A lot of those things, those elements that made the package so attractive, are now available in other places. And so, the autocratic narrative is stronger than it was, and autocracies are wealthier than they used to be. So they can buy politicians and influence all over the world, and they can purchase apartments in Miami and New York with stolen or laundered money. And they can even, as we learned in 2016, although as I learned some years before that, they can even shape narratives and conversations inside our information space. And so I think if I can stop there. I mean, there are other things too, but I think those are probably the three biggest changes that I think have had the most profound effect on people's faith in democracy, not just in America, but everywhere.
Yeah, I was really interested in what you said about this sense of loss of control that comes with globalization. And I have to think that was a lot of the driving force behind Brexit, or am I wrong about that?
That was certainly the language that the Brexiteers successfully used, their slogan was literally "Take back control." It was in many ways a false slogan. I mean, it was completely a false slogan. And I'm in London now, and so far the experience of Brexit is one of the UK having less influence, less control, isolating, less trade. I mean, it was a lie. But it was a very effective lie, because it spoke to something that people genuinely feel quite deeply, which is that they don't have control. Their politicians are somehow weaker. These people who say they represent us can't do anything. There are these huge forces of, the economics and that we don't have any control over. So I think that that's an important and deep concern that people have. It hasn't been answered by the kind of technocratic and politics that we've had in the last couple of decades.
Right, right. So I want to go a little deeper into this appeal of authoritarianism to people who you would otherwise think would not be attracted to it. Because you started out by saying that you were speaking to people that were your friends who were more like-minded people, and suddenly you found that you weren't as like-minded. And it reminded me of a debate that goes on in my discipline in communication and in philosophy around the philosopher Martin Heidegger. I'm sure you know of him, and a well-known Nazi sympathizer who was also one of the most brilliant modern philosophers of the time. And if you look back on the history of Germany, you find that many people during the Weimar Republic and the beginning of Nazism, they were among the elite. These were intellectuals, smart people were drawn to these what you call medium-sized lies and even big lies. Have you come up with any way of explaining to yourself how people who are otherwise fairly logical in their life and thinking, how they get seduced into this more authoritarian way of believing things that may or may not be true?
So, first of all, these are our kind of 20th century prejudices, that
Okay.
the attraction to authoritarianism is somehow something that is only people who are uneducated, or it's, that elites are not attracted. I mean, in fact, if you look at the history of, even, you could go back even farther than that, but I mean, if you look at the history of the last century, I mean, whether it's Soviet communism or Nazism, or even many lesser dictatorships, they always used and required and depended on the work of intellectuals, certainly.
Mm,
So there was there a lot of attention is always paid on the dictator, on the Chavez's or or the
mhm.
Stalins, or the Lenin, but around them were always speech writers, assistant
Mhm.
translators, people who created ideas. Nowadays they might be social media experts, or people who do PR. But there's
Right.
there's always been, first of all, intellectuals have always been attracted to power and have always sought ways to be
Mm,
close to it and to have access to it. But also, I think our assumption that democracy was so obviously attractive and so obviously the best system, and there could never be
mhm.
anybody attracted to anything else. I mean, this again is a very 20th century, second half of the 20th century idea, and in our case, it's born from our experience of success. The American project, which just had its ups and downs and, terrible crises and catastrophes and so on.
Sure,
But
sure.
the experience of, from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s was one of increasing prosperity and increasing power and influence in the world. And so we began to forget that there were other ideologies that
Mhm.
had a dark appeal. I mean, the idea of absolute power, the idea that you can control all the social levers, that you can
Yeah.
be in charge of what people think and how they
Mhm.
and how they react. I mean, this is an extremely dark and attractive
Mhm.
thought for people, and again, for even for, maybe even particularly for intelligent people. I mean, in the book I talk a lot about. I have a little section on a kind of behavioral psychologist called Karen Stenner,
Mhm.
who's worked a lot on the idea of the authoritarian predisposition. What
Okay.
makes some people predisposed to it, and I like that expression better than authoritarian personality, because
Mhm.
it means that it's not something that's ingrained. It's not like you're born as an authoritarian.
Mhm.
But she thinks that there are some kinds of people, and she reckons it's about 30% of any society, in fact, who
Interesting.
are who are bothered by cacophony and argument and distraction,
Mhm.
and who would prefer a kind of unified public space. They prefer
Mhm.
homogeneity. They prefer one set of ideas. They prefer unity, and they're bothered and annoyed and angered by division. And of course, at times of great stress and anger and division, those people become more and more convinced that what we need is someone to just take over and shut it all down and
Right.
keep it all quiet and shut everybody up. And you can see this,
Yeah.
in if you look at the French Revolution, all one of its results was Napoleon, because people said finally we
Right.
just need one person to take control. And that's a very cliched description of the French Revolution, but there's a but there's a but there is a sense where, I mean, and you can feel it in American popular culture,
Yeah.
people who are disturbed by diversity and disturbed by
Hmm.
strong clashes of opinions, and feel that we should all be singing from the same hymn book and we should all agree. And that's a in normal times, that's a kind of tolerable
Right.
instinct. Many
Right.
people have it, but in
Right.
times of real stress and strife, that instinct can develop into a support for an authoritarian leader. Somebody who's just going to make everyone shut up, be
Yeah.
quiet,
Yeah.
and move forward.
Oh, I think that's really, really an interesting insight. And it reminds me a little bit of the work in the 1980s on organizational culture, where when the anthropological idea of culture got applied to organizations, the first appeal was we need strong cultures, which would be the kind of cultures where at IBM they would all sing the company song and wear the same clothes. And there is an appeal to that. But of course, the real work of culture is usually messier than that. And so the question is, what do you do with that messiness? Can you live with it? Can you orchestrate it, or do we have to drive it out, I guess?
Well,
Uh,
if you one other another thing I did while working on this book is I went back and thought about the authors of the American Constitution and what were they
mhm.
saying about democracy at the time. And of course, they were highly skeptical. I mean, most of them were well educated in the classics, and they knew very well the stories of the various, experiments with Greek democracy,
Yeah.
and they were obsessed almost with the story of the Roman Republic and the end of the Republic and the rise
Mhm.
of Caesar and of the empire,
Yeah.
to the extent that the Roman Senator Cato was a kind of pop culture figure. There was a play about him that was very popular at the time of the American Revolution, so popular that George Washington had it put on at Valley Forge.
Wow.
So this was a part of popular culture, this idea that there had been the virtuous republic and it had collapsed into
Mhm.
chaos because of a demagogue. And of course, when the Constitution was being written, this is what people had in the front of their heads. And one of the reasons we got the somewhat awkward and peculiar political system that we have was that they were thinking about how to protect against demagogues, how to stop a demagogue from rising. In other words, how to prevent the inevitable messiness and cacophony and chaos of democracy
Right.
from deteriorating into dictatorship, because they knew it had happened before, because they were reading about ancient Rome. Um,
Mhm.
and so, and so they knew that it was possible for democracy to decline.
Right.
And then, as I said, our experience in the United States of success, particularly, as I said, in the latter part of the 20th century, I think sort of blinded us to this piece, to this understanding. We developed the idea that democracy is somehow inevitable. And if
Right.
it's inevitable, once there was even those of you who have studied, who've done this part of political science, know that there was a kind of theory, that if you've had a certain number, 3 or 4 free elections, and if you tick off the boxes of a certain kinds of institutions, then you are a democracy and you will not backslide, and you've achieved that, and the story is over. But actually, the story is never over. And
Right.
assuming inevitability also means that if it's inevitable, then you don't have to do anything about it. So
Right.
so if we don't have to do anything about democracy, well then, we can just leave politics to the professional politicians, and they can, get on with their boring thing they do, and the rest of us can whatever, we can write books or paint paintings or make money, and we don't have to think about politics because it's being taken care of by somebody else. And this was thought of as a positive thing, that we don't have to worry about it. Actually, it turns out that we do need more involvement in politics, and we do
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
civic conversation, and we do need more people involved, even at the very lowest levels of politics, in local. I mean, it doesn't have to be partisan, but local
Right. Right.
parties,
Right.
or making the elections run. Elections are run with volunteers. Um, and engagement in politics, in public debate, in civic activities, in community, all these things matter in terms of building a strong democracy. And that somehow got lost, as I said, particularly I think in the 80s and 90s.
So what I hear you saying is that we made two mistakes. One is we sort of took it for granted and we overgeneralized from a period of relative stability to think that this is not something that we have to continue to accomplish. This is something we can somehow take for granted and leave to the professionals. That's what you're
Yeah,
saying, right?
I
Yeah.
think that's how many people felt about politics. It was
Yeah.
a kind of thing that was a specialized activity for
Right.
particular kinds of people, and the rest of us didn't really have to, we could show up to vote once every 4 years, but we didn't really have to do anything
Right.
else.
Right. Let me pivot a little bit and ask you a question specifically about some of the things that are happening in Florida and Texas. And I want to get your feelings about courage, personal courage, and personal resistance. There's been a lot of talk in Florida as well as some other states about disobeying and standing up to government laws. And we're seeing it now in Texas with the airlines and vaccine mandates and things like that. And I'm noticing in the response to COVID in some of these states that there are universities and university professors resigning. And I've even seen emails that have said, I've chosen this as my hill to die on. And people make references to Nuremberg and say, just because someone tells you you have to do something, that doesn't mean that you should feel compelled to do it. You should stand up for things that you think are correct and that sort of thing. Where do you think individual courage and resistance fits into this whole picture as we start to see this movement towards authoritarianism? What's been your personal experience with it, and what's your observations about the possibility of resistance and of individual courage?
So, I mean, there were sort of several things going on in that question, might require picking apart. I mean,
Sure.
the anti-vax movement and the refusal to be vaccinated is not a demonstration of civic courage. I mean, it's a demonstration that you've been very badly manipulated by people who wish you ill, because
Right. Right.
taking a vaccine, is first of all protection for you and for your family and for the people who you meet, and second of all, it's an act of participation in public life. I mean, the reason why we have childhood vaccines is so that we have herd immunity. We don't have polio anymore.
Hmm.
And so by being vaccinated, you contribute to the general good. And so, I would describe the vaccine as being vaccinated as a kind of civic duty. I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
particularly in the current circumstances where we're dealing with a disease we still don't understand that well, and it's very new, and
Right.
the vaccines represent this extraordinary scientific leap, certainly in the case of the mRNA vaccines.
Hmm.
So I don't really see the anti-vaxxers as representing civic courage. I think they represent a kind of tragic form of manipulation. I mean, there are people who have been convinced in some cases by people who have themselves been vaccinated. I mean, the famous example now is Fox News, which allows anti-vax people onto its programs, whereas the network itself has required at different times mask wearing and just about everybody
Right.
there is vaccinated. So there's a lie that's being sold to people, and that's disturbing. I mean, and separately, acts of civic courage, are all around us in many places. I mean, I'm a great admirer, for example, of Liz Cheney,
Hmm.
who's somebody who has insisted on speaking the truth inside her party, saying that, insisting that the 2020 election was not stolen, and that the attempt to convince people that it was stolen is undermining American democracy. I mean, we mentioned medium-sized lies. I mean, which is another expression I've used for conspiracy theories.
Right.
Um, and she's somebody who, has taken an enormous amount of personal flack by standing up and saying, and saying what she believes. But I mean, and you can find people all across the political spectrum who are willing to stand by what they believe to be the truth. And people like that play, of course, an enormously important role
Mhm.
in democracies as well as autocracy. I mean, it's funny. One of the strange things about Washington in the last 4 years was the realization that I had that so many issues and elements that I know and kind of arguments I'd heard made about occupation, so I've written a book about the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and the way that people behaved under occupation. So many of those arguments have returned. Somehow they're part of Washington. At what point do you stand up when you know someone's breaking the law, or when your boss is doing something legal?
Mhm.
How much risk do you take? Do you lose your job over
Right.
something you believe? And people, people I know, and some have been in the news, and have had to make big decisions like that, in the last few years in a way that I would have found hard to imagine possible. But I think of civic courage as having the courage to stand up um, for the to stand up for the community, and to stand up for the values of democracy, uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
and and to and most importantly of all is to stand up for what you believe to be true, uh,
Mhm.
and to
Mhm.
not allow yourself or the people around you to be manipulated. But these are tricky things, and they will be seen differently from
Right.
different partisan points of view.
Well, and standing up for democracy also seems related to standing up for expertise, standing up for science, standing up for rationality, right? I think part of the reason why it all feels so very confusing is because it's not simply about politics. It's about it's about rationality. It's about science. We had Naomi Orestes came here last year and talked about her book, Why Believe Science? Um, and these are arguments that, a lot of us never thought we'd ever have to make. And now we're making these arguments, and we're finding that we're often dismissed out of hand because expertise doesn't matter. I wonder if do you think I'm going too far? I mean, I
No,
feel
no,
as
I
if
think
this is
you're right. I mean, I think that science, like universities, actually,
right.
have also suffered from the generalized loss of trust in
Hmm.
old institutions.
Hmm.
And to
Hmm.
some degree, this is again to do with more general malaise, and in that sense, America is not that different from
Right.
many other places. But there are also some issue. We began by saying how marvelous it is that you have a lecture series and that you're involved in the community. I mean, there is a
Hmm.
way in which, particularly the elite universities, have kind of retreated back into their own ivory towers,
Hmm.
and haven't been as engaged in public life as they should have been. Schools and universities actually haven't spent enough time thinking about civic education. There was a marvelous
Hmm.
article in the Atlantic
Hmm.
a couple of weeks ago by the president of Johns Hopkins, Ron
Yeah,
Daniels.
I saw it.
You saw that, right?
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting argument about how, we all know that civic education works. It's useful. Why aren't universities engaging in it? When you think about distribution requirements or whatever it is you need to people to
Yep.
pass, why shouldn't people also have to spend a little bit of time while they're in, whatever they're studying, whether it's quantum physics or nursing
Anything. Right.
or computer science? Why shouldn't they also spend a little bit of time thinking about citizenship? Because that's also what they're going to be, whatever else they are when they grow up. They will also be citizens, and not enough time has been
Absolutely.
spent thinking about that. And I think, again, those are also elements of our public culture and intellectual culture that have atrophied.
Well, let me ask you
And
a question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was saying, I mean, also, I mean, and some of this is not, I'm not blaming universities, but I mean,
Hmm.
then,
Hmm. Hmm.
the degree of specialization means that
Yep.
so much of what people do is not translated to the public, or, you can get all these misunderstandings about what science is and how it works.
Right.
Um, uh, uh, so the need for universities, for experts, for intellectuals, for scientists to make sure they are reaching people, I think is also an important part of the answer. But I mean, I do
Yep.
think that the high level of mistrust is coming from other things too. It's
Yeah.
also once again, the mistrust of any source of authority. Um, some of it is the result of, I mean, that, as you know, there are permanent online campaigns designed to discredit science, to discredit
Yes.
universities, and so on. And so some of it's the result of active politics. I mean, there's been an
Right.
active
Right.
anti-science politics that's been going on for a while now.
And those are global campaigns, right? I mean, they're
And those are global campaigns. They're worse in some. I mean, I think the anti-science campaign is much worse in the U.S. than it is, for example, in Germany,
I
where
see.
I
I
mean,
see.
you could see that in some of the reaction, even just to the conversation about the coronavirus. There were a lot of
Sure.
places where people were willing to listen to medical advice and so on in a way that America, not such a large percentage. I mean, not everybody in Germany, I should say, but
Right.
a higher percentage. There,
Mhm.
so I mean, so there are cultural differences in terms of what.
Sure.
But yes, I mean the distrust of experts, the distrust of central
Mhm.
authority, that is pretty universal.
Well, let me give you an interesting dilemma. So I agree with you that we should spend more time as part of our general education with civic education. As it turns out, our Republican controlled legislature in Florida agrees with you as well. And they passed a law this year that said that beginning next year, all of our students have to take 6 credit hours in civic education. And the challenge now is for us to develop that curriculum. And so just because you make it a law and just because your requirement doesn't excuse you from figuring out what does that actually mean, right? And the question of what you would put in there, obviously the easy things to put in are this is how government is supposed to work, right? But then all the interesting things that go around that, I think will be very much contested as we try to put that curriculum together. And so I was wondering what you thought about that. Did you know that Florida passed a law to insist on civic education in its university?
I knew there were. I mean, there are different versions of this. Some more sinister and some less sinister. That I know are unfolding around the country, including laws designed to instruct teachers on how they should teach about race, for example, which are some of which are far more pernicious than that. I mean, if I were you, I would take advantage of this
That's
wonderful
what,
decision of the
indeed.
Florida legislature.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I would design courses where students are taught to debate, where they're taught to do public speaking, where they're taught how to
Mhm.
read and write op-eds, for example. This is
Yeah,
something I think is
yeah, yeah.
having people think about what it is that they're reading in the newspaper and how people, getting them to pay attention to the style and way, political writing, political journalism
Beautiful.
works. Having people compare and contrast newspapers and news sources. I mean, I think there's an enormous amount that you could do that could be very interesting, and you could do it in a way that was, I don't know, maybe this is too Pollyanna-ish, but I mean, I can imagine doing it in a way, if not,
You're going to say
bipartisan.
nonpartisan, aren't
I
you?
was going to say not. I was going to. I don't want to say nonpartisan, but I was going to say somehow. And then I thought of the word Catholic, meaning in the sense
Yeah, yeah,
open
yeah,
to
yeah,
everybody.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
but
yeah.
the but that is somehow open to different kinds of
Yes,
views,
yes.
but focuses on what are the rules of the conversation and what are the
Nice,
rules of the society and
nice,
what are
nice,
the how
nice.
is the electoral system work and
Yeah,
why does it
yeah,
work, and
yeah,
and that focuses on the rules, who makes the rules, how they're made, why we came to agree on them for such a long time,
yeah.
and in which you didn't argue about specific policy
Hmm.
issues.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
once you go down the road of arguing about, I don't know, tax,
Whatever.
even
Yeah,
whatever,
exactly.
then you're in a partisan conversation. But if you can talk about what are the shared values, and even try and understand what differences people have, I think
I
you can
love
make it
that. And
beautiful.
I love that. And I think we're going to do that. I'm going to share your optimism about it and going to take this opening as an opportunity to try to do that. And I think, I think it's conceivable that something quite good could come out of it. So we're about to go to the questions from the audience. But before we do that, I want to give you just a couple of minutes to talk about your perspective on the internet. You wrote this incredible story about, I think it was in the Atlantic, right, about how the internet could be a positive thing. And I know you're active on Twitter. You've been following what's going on with Facebook. Can you just give us your perspective on what the future could hold for the internet if we could get our arms around it in a different way than we are currently dealing with it?
So this is it's a difficult question, and anyone who says they have an easy answer is,
Is not
is
not
misleading
right.
you.
Yes.
So in the piece, which so those who are interested, maybe we can send a link afterwards.
Sure.
Me and my colleague Peter Pomerantsev went through some of the main arguments about what could be done about the internet, and I'll just I'll be try and be as brief as possible here. So
Mhm.
one of the answers would be a form of regulation, but not regulation of the kind you think it's going to. So it's not that there's going to be a ministry of truth where someone sits in a room and scratches things off the internet and says, you can't say that,
Okay.
you can't say
Right.
that. But instead, the regulation would focus on the algorithms, which is actually what Facebook and YouTube are. I mean, they don't produce the content, they produce the distribution of the content. Um, and if you could, and the algorithms are essentially like a set of rules that favor certain kinds of stories and interactions over others.
Hmm.
And right
Hmm.
now, the way they're set is for the way the companies think they can use them to make the most money, which is that, they're set to keep people engaged and online as much as possible so that they'll
Right.
click on as many ads as possible. And so with it, they can go on gathering data about them. So if we could if we could instead insist that the algorithms are, instead of favoring, engagement, which means pushing anger, emotion, division, and things that make people upset, if they could instead favor rational conversation and better exchanges, and then that would be one way of
Hmm.
making the feel of social media, a little bit more civilized. And so and that's a whole kind of rabbit hole you can go down, and you
Yeah.
can talk
Yeah.
about how it could be done, and the different ways of thinking about, but focusing on the algorithms as the thing to regulate rather than the
Hmm.
content, is really important. I mean, the second thing is, beginning there are, and a lot of people are now working on, alternative social media, so kind of public interest or public service social media. What would that look like?
Hmm.
What if you could have conversations or public debates online, but do it in such a way that the point was to, instead of creating all these arguments like Twitter does,
Hmm.
um, what if you created consensus? And so people are natural, and this is also, it sounds, science fiction, but actually it works. I had in the piece, to do the piece, we had a long conversation with a woman called Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister of Taiwan, who
Hmm.
runs these periodic national debates, which take place on a kind of software platform that does exactly that. So you put in your statement, what you feel about an issue, and then you discover whose views are similar to yours. So rather
Mm.
than finding the people who hate you or oppose you, you find commonalities. And one of the effects of doing this is that you can create a consensus. You discover that actually there is a middle of the road answer, there's a solution that people agree on. And so finding more creative ways essentially to use the online world, and more, productive ways to create kind of, you know democratic deliberative space where there's good conversation. I mean, and it's not about getting certain outcomes or getting people to agree or
Right.
about anything like that. I'm just saying, if the rules of the conversation are better, they produce better conversation. And this is why we always had parliamentary rules,
Right.
and this is why there were conventions about how you spoke on television or whatever it was. So there are your
Hmm.
debate rules. When you have rules that encourage better conversation, you get better conversation. And so that's a that's a second way to think about an answer. And then briefly, I mean, this, because I only mentioned because it's one of the things that will certainly come up. Then there's a lot of talk about breaking up the companies just because they're too powerful,
Right.
and that actually might happen. Even in this administration. But my concern about that is that I don't know why 12 Facebooks is better than.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so,
Well, then
So,
you just
you know,
pick the Facebook. Yeah, you pick the Facebook that agrees with you, right?
yeah. So, I mean, anyways, you know, but that we may go down that road as well. But the point I want to make for those, and for those who are interested, there's always more to read about it, is that there
Yeah.
are people out there who are thinking about creative alternatives and solutions. And so eventually one of those will rise to the surface and get enough political will behind it. You know, I do think it's
I hope
possible. We don't
so.
have to just give up and be apathetic and say nothing can be done.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I have to say, years ago, I was part of a group called the Dialogue Project. My field is communication, and there were a lot of us that were trying to promote public dialogue and democracy. And it's really taken a beating the last, decade or so. And the whole idea is very much what you're saying, is that can we change the rules of the game, whether we're talking about algorithms or guardrails or accepted norms, to encourage affinity and hold difference, as opposed to forcing people to push away from each other and create their own bubbles, right? And so that's very interesting. And I like what you said at the end, is that you think that some creative people will come up with maybe some experiments in this where
Well,
we
I mean, it is happening. It's unfolding as we speak. You know, I can. You know, there are people thinking along exactly these lines.
oh, wonderful. Oh,
And so
that's
it's just a question of, you know, there's a political will question. There's a
profitability
level of,
and
you know, is
gotcha.
the
Yeah.
level of understanding high enough to, you know, to push
Yeah.
this forward. But it's filtered its way into Congress. I mean,
Good.
it's
Good.
not impossible.
Yeah, I certainly got the sense from this Facebook whistleblower testimony that there may be a disconnect between the kind of dialogue that you and I might like to see among citizens and the profitability, because of the appeal of these emotionally charged posts, right?
Yes, I mean, there's also a contradiction. I mean, I mean, it's almost amusing. You know, Facebook spends a lot of money hiring ethicists, you know, and philosophers and people who will help them come and think about how their platform is affecting people. And then when these people produce, you know, reports, then they say, "Oh my God, we can't have that," and they throw them out.
Right.
And so sooner or later, I mean, this is what this whistleblower was, and
Right.
there's several others out there as well. So sooner or later, this was going to backfire as the people who've been hired to make Facebook nicer object when when their advice is ignored.
Understood. All right, I'm going to ask you some questions from the audience, unfiltered, and for you to take up. So, one question is, why do the Polish and Hungarian populations lean towards authoritarianism when they were a satellite of the Soviet Union? Is it a generational difference in perspective? How could they return to authoritarianism?
So that's really interesting because very often that question is asked the other way. In other words, people say, "Oh well, those countries were totalitarian in the past, they were
Uh,
communist, and that's why they're having this reversion to somehow their true form." I mean, my view of Poland and Hungary is that the forces that have led to you know, we in both countries, to be clear, we still have elements of democracy. Poland is still a democracy. Hungary is maybe less so, but
right.
they're run by ruling parties who've spent a lot of effort trying to chip away at the institutions that make democracy possible. You know, the free press, which doesn't really
Hmm.
exist in Hungary anymore, or
Right.
the independent
Universities.
judiciary, which Poland is pushing back against. But
Hmm.
I think the forces that you see at work in those two countries exist everywhere. Um, and to some extent, it's kind of a matter of percentage of the population and a little bit of fluke and luck that they have won power in those two countries and not yet anywhere else. I mean,
Mm.
you know, there's a easily imaginable future in which Italy is run by a party like that.
Hmm.
There's an imaginable future where France is run by a party like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, you know, the British situation is more complicated and difficult, but there are elements of this kind of authoritarian populism in the British Tory party now as well. So, and certainly we have it in the US Republican Party.
Right.
You know, this and as I said, kind of amazingly similar given how
Hmm.
different these kind of countries we are. So I don't think there's anything special about Poland and Hungary, in fact.
Okay.
Remember that
Okay.
Poland, prior to the current government, Poland had for you know, 30 years, well, not quite 30 years, but, you know, more than 2 decades,
Hmm.
it had liberal and, you know, governments that were, you know, very excited to be involved with and integrated to the rest of the world.
Right.
And there's still a very, you know, very large and loud and powerful liberal, and by liberal I mean European liberal. I mean,
Right.
you
Right.
know,
Right.
free markets and free society liberal. There's still a big part of the population that is like that. So it's just a question of whether they can now win an election, given how rigged the system is.
All right. So it's less, you're saying it's less about their history vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and more about these general kind of trends and tendencies that are
Yeah,
happening across the democratic world or
yeah. I mean,
the
one of the other
democracies.
ironies that is worth knowing, I mean, just for given how the question was put, is that the Polish ruling party, which describes itself as a, you know, Catholic nationalist party, has quite a number, an amazing number of former communists in it.
Hmm.
In sort of, so in a way, the thinking of the old Polish Communist Party, you find it, you know, kind of rejuvenated in this extremely strange way on the right. Um, I know that sounds strange, particularly to Americans who imagine these are opposite views.
Right. 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 Right.
But the attitudes, you know, of the old Communist Party, you know, are to some extent you can see them revived in, you know. And remember, there was a percentage of the country that was pro-communist.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, the opposition was turned out to be the majority in the end, but there was a strong pro-communist minority all the way through, and so that, and some of, I mean, it's 30 years later and everything's different now, but I mean, there's to some extent the legacy of that group of people is what we're seeing revived in a kind of different form using different language today.
One person is asking about the January 6th insurrection and your opinion about what the United States needs to do to sort of deal with the legacy of that day.
So that's a really big, wide question. You know, the first thing I would do is establish exactly what happened and who was, you know, what was the
Who did
sequence of
what?
events,
Mhm.
and in particular, what was the involvement of members of Congress and members of the Trump administration? Because I think
Mhm.
that's, you know, we know there was involvement. It's still a little bit foggy.
Mhm.
Um, the second thing I would do would be to focus really hard on this voting rights issue and voting legislation. I
Mhm.
am not an expert in this, and I can happy to point people to people who are more eloquent on what, you know, what has to be done. But I mean, I'm really concerned about laws being passed that will enable, for example, that might enable state legislatures to override the popular vote in a
Right.
presidential election.
Right.
I'm worried about laws being passed that'll make it too difficult for some parts of the population to vote.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I'm quite worried about some of the low level um, competition for, you know, for kind of electoral oversight jobs,
Mhm.
and some of the people who want them on the ballot, you know, who say they want to reverse the result of the 2020 election. In other words, so the, you know, the legacy of January 6th isn't only the event itself, it's also the impact that it had on a part of the Republican Party, I should say,
Mhm.
which, you know, which there's now a growing number of people who believe the election was stolen, and that therefore, um, you know, they need to intervene in some extra legal way in order to either reverse it or make sure it doesn't happen next time. And I am worried about a 2024 election, which is even uglier than 2020.
Yeah, no, I am very worried about that too. And that connects to our earlier conversation about it doesn't matter if there's facts or evidence, because in our current media environment, you just have to say it, right? So one question, it's a little bit of a longer question, but I think the crux of it is one would think that healthy evolution of democracy would have more use of direct democracy. And this questioner says Brexit is a bad example. On the other hand, it's been good in cases like voting referendums on voting rights or marijuana, or felony convictions and the ability to restore voting rights. Do you think that direct democracy is a part of the fix to improve the crises that democracies are facing? Does that question make sense to you?
So I do think that you can have. I mean, I'm very in favor of experimenting with democracy. So I would include direct democracy. I would include the idea that I was just speaking about. You know, the more public debates conducted online, maybe
Love
even
it.
voting. You know, maybe even issues being decided in public fora, in not just behind closed doors by officials. Um, so yes, I'm interested in thinking about how elections could be conducted differently and in a way that drew people in a more direct way. I mean, I suppose the only problem with direct those one issue votes is that quite a lot of government isn't one issue issues. I mean, it's kind of
Right.
general budget decisions, and it's to do with building roads or and it doesn't lend itself to that kind of one issue vote. But I'm not against it, and there are countries. I mean, for example, I looked into a couple of years ago the Swiss system of democracy, which
Mm.
involves an enormous number of referenda, and they play a really important part in shaping Swiss democracy and in involving people in politics. They have a system where you can have a petition to call a referendum on anything, actually, and it will be a national referendum.
Fantastic.
And it's I mean, it can be used for ill or for good. I mean, and there's examples of both. But I'm not against that. I just like to see more experimentation in general. More thought about how to vote. There are different voting systems that are worth ranked choice voting. There was a bad example recently in New York, but there
Right.
are very good examples, I think, in Maine and elsewhere. I mean, the ranked choice voting would then mean people voted for more than one person, and it has
Hmm.
the possible advantage of reducing polarization, because if you need to, essentially any voting system that will force candidates to need to make a broader appeal. So you can't win just with your 30%, of
Exactly.
your party. You need a broader coalition of people to support you. Anything like that can also
Hmm.
help. So there are a lot of things to think about there, and I would hope that at the state level there might be more experimentation along those lines.
It's something that frustrates me when I read a lot of really, really good historians is that, and other kinds of work, is they do a great job of describing the problem, but then they sort of get off the bus when it comes to coming up with solutions. And what I love about your work is that you are really struggling with trying to find a way forward. And I guess this is my last question for you, which is I want to give you an opportunity. A lot of the questions that I didn't ask you are basically saying, Anne, are we doomed? and and we could be, America, the world, the human race, the earth. So you've already answered that question. Clearly, your answer is you don't think we are. And you've said we can experiment with democracy. We could possibly change the algorithms around disinformation. We could improve civic education. I'm giving you an outline for your next piece here. Is there anything else, especially we've got a lot of college students listening in today, is there anything else that you would encourage people to do? There's such a sense of hopelessness and confusion, at least in Florida, maybe in the US right now, about the future of all these things. Is there anything else that you'd like to sort of suggest could be potential positive things that we could be doing to move in a positive direction?
So first of all, I'd like to say that nothing is ever inevitable. So
Nice.
decline is not inevitable, but neither is, the persistence of American democracy. Everything depends on decisions that we make every day. I mean, there are no rules to history. There's no law that makes something
Hmm.
happen.
Hmm.
And so the result, what happens in America, does depend on what all of us do. So there's no, in that sense, there's never any reason for despair. You can always do something. And I actually find that one of the cures for becoming depressed about politics, which does happen to me, is to do something. And there are so many ways in which people can be engaged in public life. I mean, you can.
Hmm.
I mean, you can do it in a partisan way. You can join a party. You can be a candidate for something at the lowest level. You can try and get someone elected. But you can also, there are so many groups now that are looking to promote and increase local democracy. I mean, there's one I'm an advisor to called Protect Democracy that does a lot of really interesting work. You could join them, you could donate a little bit of money, you could be on their mailing list, you could learn what they do,
Hmm.
you could get involved in some of their projects. There are, every time there's an election, they need volunteers to, man the ballot booths and to
Hmm.
organize. I mean, there's so many ways in which you can be involved in your community in small ways and large ways, depending on how much, not everybody has time. And I find that doing those things makes you feel, I mean, it's not just about you. It's about, you're
Right.
contributing to public life, but it's a cure for feeling hopeless.
Yeah, that's
Do
wonderful. And
something.
so the choice is between being alone with your computer and feeling angry and despairing, or
Right.
going out into the world and starting to roll the rock in a positive direction. I
Just
really appreciate that.
join something, do something, vote for something, contribute somehow. It doesn't have to be very big or very, important.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I really, excuse me, the thing I really learned from you tonight, Anne, is that this idea of that we sort of lulled ourselves into, it's almost like American exceptionalism. It's of that ilk, right? This idea that democracy was inevitable. And what you're saying is it's fragile and must consistently be remade. And the way we do that is by doing it, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
and not only that, our founding fathers knew that it was
they
fragile.
knew that. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
talking about it while they were writing our Constitution.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I don't even know what time it is in London. It's
It's
late,
late.
right?
It's
Oh my
late.
goodness. Well, thank you for staying up so late. I know that as we look forward to future elections and political shifts, we'll be better prepared to examine where we're getting our information from and to think critically when someone is trying to sell us something that is looking like the truth. Keep going. I want to thank everybody who worked to make this event a success tonight. We can't do it without you. Thanks again to our Frontiers of Knowledge donors for your generous support. And please stay in touch with us on our social media channels, whatever their algorithms are, or our websites for updates about our next Frontier Forum speaker, who will be microbial ecologist and professor of biology, Dr. Forrest Rohrer, who will be here on February 8th, 2022. And folks, it's going to be in person, God willing. We hope you will all continue to stay healthy and safe. We can't wait for all of you to join us again. Thanks again to Anne Applebaum. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Have a great night and go Bulls.